Forgive my voice. I'm kind of sick. So I want to show the what I believe the week of Jesus' death looks like, and kind of show an illustration of what can be confusing. Because some people dispute certain gospel writers. One example of the way some people might try to argue is maybe some of the authors of the one gospel. I didn't study this part, but I remember this from just interacting with people. Something like this. Does some of the authors of some of the Gospels work with Roman time? Roman time does a different rendering than biblical time. Biblical time from day to day is sundown to the next sundown. That's one day of the week. Roman is kind of like how we do it today, with where it's midnight to midnight from one day to the next. So I believe that the biblical authors were working with biblical time based off of Genesis, which is even to even. So when you're trying to work out the timeline, for instance, from the text of the week Jesus died, those assumptions come to bear on how you count days and work out a timeline. And people dispute how that should be understood based on the text. But let me. So a lot of people who advocate for the seventh-day Sabbath, especially people who have a background from more of an Armstrong sort of worldwide Church of God instead of not Adventist. Adventists accept the prominent historical greater Christian understanding that is common. Armstrong came along, I would argue, from an obscure couple texts in the English translation that make it seem ambiguous. And he made the claim that, actually, Jesus didn't even rise on Sunday. He rose on the Sabbath. And a lot of people, along with them, like the Hebrew roots people, think the Sabbath and stuff was based on the ceremonial Sabbaths. So Jesus died on Wednesday and then rose on Saturday, which would mean he was dead for 4 days, by the way, which doesn't work, in my opinion. And there's disputes over what day of the week it was, because the weekly cycle doesn't correspond the same with the Hebrew the Hebrew calendar. And some people then think they can figure out what exact day of the week it was in a given year in the past, like for instance in 31 or 33 AD or whatever. They think they know, but I've looked at this. My conclusion is you can't know for sure because of sighting of the moon. And as what we can get from the text, though, is that it was the weekly Sabbath for sure. And then the next day Jesus rose, according to the text. I'm not really meaning to argue that fully here, but depending on your criteria for what would disqualify some point, it seems to me if he died on Wednesday and he rose even on Saturday, that would be 4 consecutive days he was dead. And that would actually be a problem for saying he is going to raise on the third day. The way they counted days, if he was dead on Wednesday, if he's dead any part of Sabbath, that's 4 days. It's too much. You can't say that, because if that were true, he would, on the fourth day would have been seen as a corruption of their body, according to what they understood. That's why Jesus let Lazarus be dead for a certain amount of time, because then there's no dispute about him being dead. There couldn't be, right? Or something like that. I forget how that goes. Or the body being corrupt, something like that. It seems like. Sorry, I'm getting off track here. I just want to show. Some people will say, well, Jesus died on Friday and he rose on Sunday. That's not 3 days, because it says 3 days and 3 nights. So if you think that, so here's the problem. Jesus dies right before sundown on Friday. Sundown, once the sun goes down on Friday, its Sabbath starts. So let's say it this way, though, because Friday, technically, by our rendering today, or a Roman rendering, like midnight to midnight, Sabbath isn't actually Saturday per se on our rendering today. It's Friday night to Saturday night. So the if Jesus died before the sun went down on Friday, our rendering, then that's still part of the 24-hour period before the Sabbath day, the 24-hour period. So 3 days and 3 nights is like an idiom for 3 consecutive days. Let me show a chart here. So up above, we have a Roman week, and the blocks are the 24-hour periods that are days. In the center is kind of just like an illustration of the day-night cycle. I know there's not 12 hours of night and 12 hours of day. So I lined them up according to the Roman week and what I would say is the biblical rendering of a week, from even to even. So see. Okay, let me zoom in a little more. This is my rendering of the traditional view of Jesus' death. The problem I have with people say he rose on Saturday, there's like nobody who said that in history, including the people early. It would be so nice if Jesus rose on Saturday, if that were true, if it was during the Sabbath. It's like, for someone who keeps the Sabbath, which I do, but we would say Jesus did rise on the day after the Sabbath. After the Sabbath day ended, Jesus was still dead. And then sometime after the Sabbath day was over, the 24-hour period or whatever of the day that's called the Sabbath day, he was still dead for at least some amount of time and then rose. It may have been before sunrise on what we call Sunday. But he would have had to, for it to be true that Jesus rose on the Sabbath, he would have had to rise from the dead while the sun was still up on Saturday. I just don't, that's just not what the text says. Because some people will go, well, like in John 20 here, the first day of the week comes Mary Magdalene when it was yet dark unto the sepulchre and see the stone taken away from the scripture. So he was already risen, seems like. And it was the first day of the week started at sundown on Saturday. So Jesus was risen, like it kind of sounds like he rose right at the sunrise on Sunday, but that's halfway through the day after the Sabbath, because the whole night portion there would be part of the day after the Sabbath. See what I mean? Here's the Sabbath on the chart, and it's running through Roman week and the biblical week. Because in a biblical week, if Jesus rises before this, any time after the sun goes down on Saturday, it's the next day. It's after the Sabbath. The only way Jesus rose on the Sabbath is if he rose from the dead before the sun went down on Saturday. So this is how it would run through. The Sabbath would be part of Friday on a Roman week, or the way we render days. And so right there on the Roman week, the sun goes down right there. And that's on a biblical week down below. That's when the Sabbath day, the 24-hour period of the Sabbath, ends. So I say Jesus died before the sun went down right here on Friday. That's when he died. And there was still a few hours of sunlight because they're trying to get his body down and buried before the Sabbath drew on. And they kept the Sabbath according to the commandment. Think about that. Kept the Sabbath according to the commandment. I think that's the weekly Sabbath. I think that language suggests that strongly. And then he rose it was the first day of the week when they come to the tomb. So there's where Jesus dies. Well, it was still the 24-hour period called the day before the Sabbath on a biblical week. On the 6th day. He died on the 6th day of the week before the next day started. So in inclusive counting, which we know they used, this is the first day, the day before the preparation day. Jesus is dead on the preparation day. The 24-hour period, which is the day before the Sabbath, called the preparation day, Jesus dies day 1. The Sabbath draws on, and he's dead the whole 24-hour period called the Sabbath day. That's day 2. And then sometime after the sun went down on Sabbath, right here, end of the daylight period of the Sabbath day, he resurrected. It doesn't say when, but it seems to me that he rose before the sun was up, probably right before the sun came up. It's not clear, but we know it was dark. So at some point after the sun went down on Sabbath, which is the end of the 24-hour period in a biblical week, sometime after that, which would be the day after the Sabbath, the first day of the week, sometime in the dark portion, most likely, Jesus rose. He was risen. Before the sun was up, the stone was away. So that's the third day. So was Jesus dead for 3 consecutive days? Yes. He was dead on Friday. He was dead on Sabbath. Or let's say it this way. He was dead on the preparation day before the sun went down. The Sabbath hadn't started yet and he was already dead. So he was dead on the preparation day. So the first day Jesus was dead on was the preparation day, the 6th day of the week. So he's dead on the day called the preparation day. That's for the first day. He's dead. The whole entire 24-hour period of the Sabbath, he was dead. That's day 2. Sometime after the sun went down on Sabbath, he's still dead. And so he's dead on the 24-hour period after the Sabbath ended. You can call it the first day of the week, you know. So in a biblical rendering, Jesus was dead on 3 consecutive days. And he rose what? On the 3rd day. What's the 3rd day? If he rose on the day after the 24-hour period called the Sabbath day was over, then he was dead on the 3rd day for some part of it, and he rose on it. And he was dead for 3 consecutive days. 3 different 24-hour periods that are consecutive, he was dead on. So it qualifies. You can't make, if you insist that 3 days and 3 nights means he was dead on 3 night portions consecutively and day portions, the way people try to make that work, it doesn't, because he's dead on more than that. If you'd say Wednesday to Saturday. And it's like, think about this. I don't accept it for various reasons, but I'm not going to defend right now because I'm going to end this. And I want to write it out before I do, to look at all the potential texts that come to bear on this. This just gives you an idea of things to consider on this chart regarding trying to clarify the difference between a biblical week and a Roman week, which is what we still operate under, and what can make it confusing. And then people will say things like, oh, that doesn't qualify because that's not 3 days and 3 nights. Well, we know he died in the daylight portion of the first day he died, which seems to be before the Sabbath, which is a traditional view. Think about it. So if he rises on Saturday, you're going to have too many evenings and too many morning sections. And that's just not what it's saying anyway. To rise on the 3rd day and for it to be 3 evening portions and 3 day portions of 3 days, that's not the point. 3 days and 3 nights just is like an idiom for three consecutive 24-hour periods, I think. But people have different criteria that they think it has to follow, that they demand, and then they advocate for different views. So it gets really complicated. But one of the main things that for me is, do you know what kind of conspiracy? I mean, it would be so nice if it were true that Jesus rose on Sabbath. But think of how silly that would be, that everybody believed he rose on the day after the Sabbath in the early church. Like, there was nobody disputing what day he rose on from the earliest times. So this is where like history meets your interpretation of the text, like, and where you have to try to be realistic. Everybody missed the fact that he died. They really rose on Sabbath and not Sunday. That's so stupid. That's insane. And just everybody got it wrong from the very beginning. They don't know which day he rose on. I mean, this is insane. Like it's like saying we didn't go to the moon, or like the earth is flat. In my mind. I mean, I don't mean to be rude or mean, but I mean, that's quite a conspiracy to think without any evidence of somebody disputing that. Oh, no, he actually rose on Sabbath. The try to explain. I mean, people don't even try to explain that. There's, oh, look, I can show you this text that kind of, I forget which text it is, but it kind of sounds ambiguous, which can make you think, oh, wow, that maybe that's right. Maybe which day he rose on. But when you look at the translations, it's how you translate the day after the Sabbath, like in John 20, the first day of the week. The first day of the week is after the Sabbath ends. That's when she came to the tomb. A day after the one of the Sabbaths or whatever it says. Like, it's how that we know they rendered the first day of the week. People will translate that in English differently. Of course, the Sunday keeper, like some of these Presbyterians will say, oh, that it says first day, and then it says the word Sabbath in the Greek. So, and they'll try to say that means that it's a new Sunday Sabbath. But we know how, like, when you look at all the way the English translations, you see it's talking about Sunday. Like word for word translation, sure, it says first day in the word for Sabbath, which means because they counted the days of the week to the Sabbath. The first day until the Sabbath, the second day after the Sabbath, or the third day until the next Sabbath, because they were, so the word Sabbath can like also be rendered to talk about a week, because the entire week is based off of the Sabbath. 1 day to the Sabbath, 2 days to the Sabbath, 3 days to the Sabbath, something like that. It's not saying when it says Sabbath first day, it's saying the day after the first day of the week. The Sabbath is kind of like the way of talking about the week. And they counted the days unto the Sabbath. That's why it's rendered as the first day of the week in every single English translation. Because their entire time period was based on the day God rested in creation. And the day you rest, have the day off and honor God as creator, the real true God that created the world. Everything cycled around that. The Lord's day, you could say. The day that the Lord calls his, the true creator God. And so she came on the first day of the week and he was risen. Jesus was dead on the day before the Sabbath, the entire Sabbath, and on the day after the Sabbath. And then he also rose that day, 3 days.